Welcome to Full PreFrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive functions. This show is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. These conversations will introduce mental tools that will empower you to shift your mindset for a successful life. And now, here's your host, Sucheta Kamath.
And welcome back to Full PreFrontal, where we are exposing the mysteries of executive function. I am here, as always, with our host, Sucheta Kamath. Good morning, Sucheta. Yet another great conversation. I can't wait.
Good morning to you, Todd. And it's such an exciting time because we have another fantastic expert, and I can't wait to talk to him. But before we get started, I thought I'll kind of share this quick story that came to my mind. Today, we're going to talk about experts, and experts are not born, but they are made. And this funny story, which is kind of a old story at this point, but came to my attention, that Eric the eel, have you heard of him?
I don't think so. Or at least I don't recognize it. So maybe if you give me more information, I might.
Yes.
Yeah, I haven't heard of him either.
So Eric Musambani Malongo entered Olympics to represent Equatorial Guinea. So at that year, I think it was 2000, when the Olympics took place in Australia, the officials decided to offer wildcard seats to 3 competitors from very, very underprivileged countries whose Olympians or whose athletes may not have had any chance to develop the skills and abilities to participate in Olympics. So Eric shows up to this 100-meter race, freestyle race, and of course, he had never swam in the Olympic-sized swimming pool before coming to the Olympics and the day of. And he had only practiced swimming for 8 months. And he and the 2 other contestants from 2 other countries, which were also wild card, all 3 of them stood about to enter the water when the gun was shot, and 2 disqualified right there because they didn't enter the pool right. And so it was just Eric swimming this 100 feet, and it took him 1 minute, 42 seconds and 72 milliseconds, apparently, which is significantly, slower rate of swimming compared to the rest of them. What was fascinating, so I don't know if you get a chance, I'll put a link in this podcast, but they have underwater cameras and you can see him struggle and you can see his imperfect strokes. And you can see he looked very buffed. He looked prepared. He must have been an athlete. He was just not the Olympic level champion. So the reason I'm talking about this, when this story hit the media, it became kind of a mockery because they were making fun of this athlete that, how did he even think to enter the Olympics with such poor preparedness? But I think now that I know the backstory that Olympic Committee was trying to give him a chance, I find this very fascinating that, yes, there's a distinct characteristics of those who are experts and those who are novices. And of course, when novices enter the field of experts, we can distinctly see the demarcation. So that's where we are here today to talk about the making of an expert who has studied this. So that brings me to our guest today, Anders Ericsson. He is a Conradi Eminent Scholar and Professor of Psychology at Florida State University. And he is from Sweden. And after his PhD, he collaborated with the Nobel Prize winner in economics, Herbert A. Simon, on verbal reports of thinking leading to their classic book, Protocol Analysis, Verbal Reports as Data. He has edited several books on expertise, and the influential Cambridge Handbook of Experts and Expert Performance consisted over 40 chapters and 900 pages, and the recent development of professional expertise, which appeared in 2009. His most recent book, which we will be focusing on today, which he published along with his co-author Robert Poole in 2016, which is titled Peak: Secrets from the New Science of Expertise. And his research has been featured in cover stories, including Scientific American, Time, Fortune, Wall Street Journal, and New York Times. And it gives me such great pleasure to talk with him because in my work, when I talk about executive function, I am talking about people becoming expert at self. So welcome, Anders, to the show, and we are so delighted to have you.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm really looking forward to talking to you.
So as I begin, this podcast is all about executive function, which entails adaptive flexibility, goal assessment, intentional focus, and goal-directed behaviors. In short, executive function is the CEO of the brain that governs and gives order to the rest of the brain to get things done and to achieve what it wants to achieve. So do you mind if I start with you as a learner and thinker? What kind of student were you when you were younger? And what kind of self-regulation did you notice in yourself? Were you attuned with your strengths and weaknesses as a learner?
Well, depends a little bit on how far you want to go back. I remember that when I was kind of in like junior high or the equivalent in Sweden, I made this contract with myself that I didn't want to memorize. I found that I was actually quite good at memorizing, but it just seemed like a total waste of time. So what I ended up doing, instead of memorizing and preparing for the history test, I would actually read like 2 or 3 books in the library about that same period. So then I could actually answer the questions, but I didn't have to kind of engage in that more focused memorization of facts, but it was more like I was trying to understand things. And I think that's probably been one of the themes that has gone through pretty much from the beginning, this idea that I really want to understand. So sometimes it's hard to know why things are the way they are. And then I guess I've found that looking at the history of how things happen, provides some kind of understanding or background to, why people are doing things in a certain way or using concepts and stuff like that.
So it's so fascinating. Sounds like you were a very curious learner and passionate about going to the depth of learning and going deep. You invented these techniques and strategies for yourself. And if you go as back as junior high, I mean, that's very insightful because most kids in junior high are just, developing pimples and just futzing around. So that's amazing. So my next question is, what expertise did you develop as you have begun to go through your own career to come to study expertise? And how did that journey go for you?
So I think the red thread through pretty much my from high school onwards was that interest in my own thinking and how I would be able to improve that. So I guess much of the research that I've been doing has been trying to answer these questions here. People that I really admire and whose thinking and performance I really admire, I would love to understand how they actually are able to do it. And I think that's kind of at the center of basically my research. And I think relatively early on in high school, I made the observation. I was playing chess just for fun. And there was one guy in particular that I was playing with. And over that year, he just got better and better. And then I guess I asked him, and he said he was part of a chess club and he was studying chess and stuff like that. And then when I realized how much time there would have to be invested if you really wanted to succeed in these, domains like chess or other activities, I think I was very clear that I wanted now to focus in on what was my primary interest, developing research methods and being able to study thinking and hopefully learn something that would be of interest to even other people.
And remarkable work that you actually did, which has influenced so many researchers who came after because you presented models of thinking, which is great. Let me ask you, what makes an expert an expert? And how is an expert different from novice?
Well, that's actually one of the starting points of kind of my research when I came to the United States. And we kind of wanted to make a distinction here between being an expert or having people think that you're an expert versus somebody who can actually do something that other people can't. And if you take sports, it's pretty clear, somebody who is able to run a marathon near in 2 hours, that's not something that anybody else, would even come close to. And, most people probably wouldn't even be able to complete the marathon, even if they just walked. So that idea here of actually finding what is it, objectively speaking, that some individuals can do that other people can't.
So that's a good distinction you're saying. That so sometimes being an expert versus being called an expert versus doing something that others can't do, such a great distinction. So there are people, we have a saying in my mother tongue, which is among calves, the cow is the strongest, So if you're competing with incompetent people or not as competent, then your slight competence can actually stand out. But what does it mean to be, have that incredible, exceptional skill set. So do experts always, or rather expertise always refers to motor skills or mental abilities that allows you to do or perform things that either exhibit faster speed and better outcomes, or there's something more to that?
Well, I think that's part of, as we're now started out studying sort of expertise that was relatively well defined and where there was organized competition. So you could in some ways say, here's somebody who's competed against all these other individuals and showed that he or she is able now to perform better than they were. But we're also applying this to all sorts of other more professional domains. So in particular, I've been interested in surgery because there you can define. And actually, when they started out doing research on expert surgeons, what they did was to just ask people to nominate individuals that they thought were the experts or the master surgeons. But what we found is that being perceived to be an expert is not necessarily the same thing as somebody with a better objective outcome. So instead of asking people, you would actually be looking now at the outcomes of their patients. And if you find now a surgeon who has better outcomes than most of his colleagues, that would be somebody who is now reproducibly better at treating patients with certain problems that require surgery.
So what steps does an individual take to reach a level of expertise?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. And I think if you were to take it descriptively, so if you look at now across domains where we have, or other people have identified now, those individuals who are actually able to do things that other people can't, what we would say is probably the most effective method in those domains where that's even possible is to have a teacher that is actually helping you now, and they're drawing on the information that they have of other people who have basically been able to attain that high level of performance. So they can almost serve like guides. So if you wanted to climb a mountain, I guess, instead of just doing it, you probably would talk to a guide who would be able to assess here whether you actually had the necessary skills here to be able to sort of use ropes or whatever techniques that would be necessary. But also they would know the path that would be the best one to reach the top of the mountain. So that's a little bit how we view this process, that, you get started, and in some, especially technical domains, it's really key that you get that initial introduction to the domain so you learn the right fundamentals, especially if you have interest here of reaching the highest levels. So in music, it's pretty well accepted that, there are certain fundamental techniques that you should be starting out with, even if you're doing simple pieces here and you're a beginner, because ultimately the way you're doing these fundamentals are going to be critical for you to be able to master the more complex techniques later on. And I've talked to coaches in sports who tell me that, it's really a sad experience when you have a really excited athlete coming to you and you see here that, they've learned how to execute their skills by themselves. So now, we're talking 6 months for them to really have to relearn the fundamentals to get back on track so they would be competitive with other individuals.
So it sounds like you get started, which is a great takeaway here, that you get started. So there's some intrinsic motivation to want to learn this skill and ability or acquire it. And then you seek out this expert or consult with somebody outside you so you can get the right process or specifics, or somebody who can dissect the elements and help put that back together. And then the third part, I think, is that individual practice or the solo practice too, right?
Right.
So before we get to that, I had a question. So I'm going to use this example. Let's say somebody is at a level 0 expertise or skills and abilities. And so their movement from 0 to 10 versus somebody who's at 5, and then their movement to 15 versus somebody who's at -10 and their movement to 0. Are those all considered similar? I don't even know if I'm presenting this question right, but is the process identical? Because I work with people with disability or people with challenges, and they don't have a skill set. For example, to develop good study skills, you need to have great attention. So when you start, if you have attention deficit disorder, you have difficulty with attention. So you're basically building your attention skill. Versus I also work with students who want to finesse their learning. And I find that they bring decent attention skill. They just don't have control over their attention. And they're learning how to polish that or remove distractions and how to kind of get a better handle on the directions or task management skills. Am I making sense?
Yeah. Now, I guess what I would say and what I find, looking at, because that's a question I get very often. Okay, I don't want to even attempt to be the best in the world. I just like to reach kind of a level here where I can play music with my friends, or, I can do golf at a level here that's comparable to the people that I'm working with. Now, I would argue that if we're talking to parents, or I kind of recommend that getting one of your children to kind of find something that they want to go deeper into, because as they're going to try to master whatever they commit to, and you as a parent, would be supporting them either directly or by finding teachers or other people who would be able to know more about the particular domain. But I think that challenge of very early on, working and actually acquiring now a high level of performance at whatever it is. And I'm not so sure that it makes a difference here, whether it's martial arts or whether it's music or, maybe drawing or whatever, because I think all of these kind of developmental histories that allows you to get to a high level in these skills seem to have that requirement of being able to control and focus your attention. And often, the teacher would give you sort of a task that you can't yet do, but by basically exploring different ways of doing it and repeating it, you will eventually be able to master it. And that is not something that can just be done here by you more or less, playing around. And I think playing is okay. It's just that you need to be very, very clear that playing with your friends in a sort of a friendly soccer game is very different from you trying to acquire some skills in soccer that require now this focus and repetition and refining what you're doing.
Got it. What I found remarkable in your book, that you talk about the goal is to build the potential rather than reach it. So it's quite a remarkable invitation and invokes growth mindset. So can we now talk about deliberate practice? What is it and how does that look like in a life of an individual who's trying to gain expertise?
Right. So we kind of contrast what most people are doing. So when you're getting into a domain, what we see that the typical person is doing is just kind of get to an acceptable level so they can now engage with other people playing tennis or playing chess or Scrabble or whatever you're doing. And we also say that in the professions, it's kind of the similar thing that for the first couple of years, you're actually improving what you can do. But after first couple of years, unless you do something special, it almost seems like you remain able to do whatever you were able to do, but you're basically not improving automatically here by just accumulating more experience. So what we've found when we look at those domains that can actually produce outstanding individuals, and I guess we started out with music, is we're looking at what is it that seems to be driving the ability of a child or adolescent at a given level to be able to do something they can't do. And that's where the teacher comes in, having knowledge about how other individuals engaged in goal-directed practice that actually allowed them now to kind of reach that higher level. And then once you've reached that, then you can basically address some new challenges and you keep going essentially for sometimes the whole life of exploration and actually pushing yourself into new areas and territories of even if you're exploring the same domain.
So sounds like it's kind of you begin to develop skills, then you run into a roadblock, and it's a true test of expert mindset, who are not even experts yet, but they have a mindset to not collapse, but they circumvent it and they keep going forward. That seems to be the biggest trick. And that requires a great adaptive mindset. And I love all the examples you have quoted. And in your research, you have found that people who took the time to review their mistakes seem to really, really benefit from that, kind of having new goals. As you said, to address new challenges, you need to know what challenges you're facing in spite of decent level of competence, correct?
Right. And there also, I think the teacher comes in knowing, because if you've never acquired a certain level of skill, say in golf or playing a musical instrument, you don't really know what the kind of challenges that other people have already encountered. So the teacher will be able to kind of guide you in a direction here where you're not actually telling yourself to do things that we know from the music curriculum might take 3 or 4 years for somebody to basically master if they're kind of working on it. So you basically have to find those adjustments to what you're doing that, are manageable within the time that is available. And we kind of contrast that a little bit with what, a lot of people do. For example, I remember, when it comes to playing darts, I would take hours and decide on goals for how I would be able to improve my ability to hit the dartboard. Now, we call that purposeful practice, and it may be improving your performance, but it lacks kind of that added validity of having a teacher that has actually helped other people reach the level that you want to reach. And they would have a much better sense here of what it is that you should focus in on and what are those kind of improvements that are actually manageable and attainable within a couple of weeks or something like that.
So that sounds like that all teachers are not made equal. So at different junction of your learning, you need to also find teachers who can fine tune your learning difficulties, and they themselves need certain level of expertise to pick out those elements in your performance.
Yeah, I think in music, it's very often kind of noticed that some teachers are really good to introduce children to music. And obviously, as you're starting, you're not going to ask them to do 4 hours of practice. It seems that about 10 to 15 minutes is what a child or a beginner can really do and actually have the sense here that they can focus, and they can also get the sense here that they're actually changing their level of performance. And over time, so when it comes to music, I guess there seems to be a gradual increase in the amount of time that individuals can successfully maintain that concentration. So it really benefits them to engage in practice. So it seems like professional musicians can maybe do 4 or maybe 5 hours a day. Beyond that, I guess I've yet to see anybody who has been able to sustain that level of practice for longer periods without getting into trouble, like a burnout where you push yourself so much that you can't really recover on a daily or weekly basis.
So you also talk a lot about what you found is about these templates or mental representations. Can I use the word mental schemas? Would that also do the job of describing what this is? Can you walk us through what these mental representations do?
Yeah, so I personally think that the way that some other psychologists are using schemas is a little bit different. And so the representation is trying to capture what is in the head of the person who is. So if we're talking about a musician who wants to play a particular piece, one of the things that you find at a given expertise level is that the musician can just look at the notes and more or less generate music in their heads without actually having the instrument. And that allows them to kind of generate very interesting sounding experiences. And then what practice is really about then is for them now to try to translate what they were able to hear in their heads into something that they can perform. And they also need to be able then to, as they're playing, listen to what it sounds like, what they're doing, so they can compare that to what they were intending to achieve. And then you create that feedback cycle. But that sort of shows now that, just going in mechanically and spend an hour repeating what you're doing is not going to improve your performance. You really need to have that ability of setting goals that are outside of what you're currently able to do. And that's kind of not driving and creating this feedback cycle so you can actually view yourself how you're making progress towards that goal. And then when you achieve that goal, then you can, select other goals.
So can you talk us a little bit about the mental representation? How did, in your research work, you identified that individuals were creating these mental representations? And what is a way to gauge that? And how do we know these representations are being formed that are fulfilling this purpose of allowing the individual to kind of have some template to work with? And how can we bring that out in learners, even in classroom? Is there some process that can promote development of creating mental representations as precursor to developing expert skills?
Yeah. So when I was doing my dissertation, that was kind of the key question to me. How would I be able to understand what's going on in the head of somebody else who is confronting problems? And that's where I sort of read and found that there was this method of thinking out loud that where people were now engaged in some activity. It could involve, practicing in your practice studio, or, you could be analyzing a chess game, or, for example, a surgeon could be planning surgery on a particular patient. And if you ask them to think out loud, you will actually now get an explication here of what's in their heads. And then, you would be able to potentially have them think out loud, the surgeon, when they're doing the surgery. And you will now see how their plan for the surgery may guide them most of the time, but then there's something that's unexpected. And then they're now in that kind of situation where they notice a mismatch between what they expected and what's really happening. And now they have to figure out ways here of addressing that mismatch.
So this is something, the way you approached it, and this is how typically people are kind of, as you said, getting into people's head to see. But when somebody routinizes or masters that a sequential process, they're not really thinking in words, correct? They are kind of seeing maybe, I don't know if it's a visual representation, but a big picture map in their head of what needs to be done. Is that fair to say?
Well, I think, and that's kind of a very good point you're making there, that you really have to challenge yourself. So if you're just doing things that you could kind of do on semi-automatic pilot, then you really don't have to generate these representations. But what's interesting is that actually surgeons who get into this almost automatic mode of dealing with patients based on, doing what they've always been doing, occasionally they encounter patients that have a different anatomy, and that may actually now create a very devastating problem. Whereas now the surgeon who was actually planning out and actually thinking through here, so when they're getting into the body, they're keeping track of the relevant blood vessels. They would be much less likely here to do that kind of problem because they're constantly monitoring what they're doing. And I would argue that when individuals are playing, competitively at their peak performance, the way they can actually do that is by being very aware of the situation. And people obviously have a problem here thinking out loud when you're playing a tennis game. But what they've done is to have tape recorders when they're changing sides. And there they can actually give a retrospective report about what they were thinking about. So you can then analyze it after the match.
That is so cool. And, I'm familiar with the work in the area of self-talk and using to mediate thinking and to help in planning and execution. But one of the things that you're talking about, all these skills that you're describing that experts possess, I find that people with executive dysfunction have challenge with. That monitoring performance in the midst of performance or executionary sequence as you're, delivering the performance is a very difficult thing for people with executive function. And so that brings me, I'm going to circle back a little bit about one of the interesting things that you have talked about in your book, and the research shows that people who engage in deliberate practice don't actually enjoy it. The work that goes into, developing skills, they do it because they care about it, they're motivated, but they don't enjoy it. And that's the difference between somebody who just picks up something and they get a lot of satisfaction, or they're kind of delighted or a little giddy over after they finish practice. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I thought that was so fascinating, because experts have reasonable expectations about, or they keep their emotions in check, that I'm not going to be over the top happy doing this practice, but such an essential practice that I'll do it.
I think that's really interesting. And that is something that we've seen, because if you define now that the kind of practice that we're trying to encourage is actually doing things that you can't do. I mean, most people would find that frustrating, but basically, if you have now this kind of confidence that if you engage in this type of activity, you will eventually master basically the goal that you set for yourself. What I would argue is that most, especially people who get more advanced levels, when they practice, it's more like they're going into a room where they're so focused in on paying attention to what they're actually doing that it's not like they're asking themselves, am I really enjoying this? They're just sort of focused. And once they get to the point here now where they actually achieve their goal, now they can relax. And that's often when, you feel good. I think some people, when you lift weights or other kinds of things, the actual lifting part, especially if you're pushing your limits, is not going to be enjoyable. But maybe that feeling when you're in the shower and relaxing, that's going to be kind of something that is enjoyable. So I think it's a matter of learning kind of the skills of knowing that you actually have to go through this process. And once you get out of it, you are actually going to feel quite good about yourself. And that skill in itself, I think, is a really key here to individuals who are successful once they move into other professional careers.
So would training individuals to manage their emotions or kind of get a hold of their frustrations, anger, irritability as they keep rubbing into things that are not, managed well, or, doing things they can't do is the very definition of new learning. So would that have any merit to it? Or does a good teacher counsel that it's going to be hard, you stick with it, don't worry? Or it's something that one has to figure out on their own?
Well, I think it's interesting. And let me talk about a couple of intriguing demonstrations. It turns out that during the concentration camps, there was a lot of people who acquired mental multiplication skills. And in some of basically these individuals were interviewed. And the reason why they gave for, basically that they got so good at multiplying numbers was that they felt that situation was so difficult to deal with that they now focused in on multiplying numbers so they can more or less forget about the, really awful situation that they were in. And I've seen that in many other cases where it sort of provides kind of a protective space where you have control. And the question is, and I guess I haven't worked with children, so I really don't know, but I could imagine that a skilled teacher would be able to make the steps sufficiently small, but essentially guide a child into this space. And hopefully, they would then, feel good about themselves because they are now able to have a control which they might not have had in their normal environment.
That's such a incredible observation. My last point about this was, experts seem to have specialized way of concentrating and putting effort. And in fact, it almost is an exercise in staying effortful. So the topic of flow, does the flow state is what they achieve when they're in the middle of deliberate practice, or that state of flow comes after you develop certain level of competence and expertise, and when you go to do that work, you are in the state of flow?
I think that's a really interesting point, and I think there's some controversy. I personally think that deliberate practice is antithetical to flow, because you're in some ways now creating this gap here between what you want to achieve and what you're currently doing. And in flow, you don't even supposedly have a sense of yourself. You're just being in sort of a very non-analytic way. Whereas if you're going to be analyzing what you're doing wrong, then obviously you need to analyze yourself. So I agree with what you were proposing here, that I think the flow experience is real. I think it's more rare than most people would argue when people actually have tried to have people keep diaries and see how often it happens, because, it's desirable. And especially people like jazz musicians, they're that kind of idea here of actually being almost in this magical harmony with your fellow musicians is something that they often strive for, but apparently relatively rarely experience. And it's sort of a little bit the way I view it is, most of the time when people perform, there is this kind of sense here that you're monitoring what's happening. But occasionally, everything goes right. And during those occasions, it's almost like when you're thinking back, you can't even remember what was happening because there was no mismatches here between what you desired to happen and what actually did happen. Now, obviously, that means that you have to, have a difficulty level that wouldn't create these problems, or at least the difficulty level would be sufficient that once in a while you would actually now experience that sense of doing exactly what you wanted to have happen. And that's what I think is flow. But I haven't personally done any research on flow, so maybe future research here will lead to a different conclusion.
Yeah, I completely see the way you're explaining. So as we close, Anders, your work has been so impactful, and you see it informing not just athletes and the coaches or performance artists and the trainers, but ordinary individuals, and encouraging them to put this kind of effort to as they search for meaning and purpose, and expertise is where the joy is, I guess. So how has this experience changed you as an individual, and what makes you so hopeful about the future with the work that you have done? And the flip side of it is what keeps you up at night?
Well, I think I'm now in a phase in my professional career where I'm really interested in helping younger researchers and other individuals who have found a domain here, and asking the questions, how would we be able to help individuals to kind of continue to have that sense of excitement, in their work situation in particular. So it's not, like what we see in many jobs that people almost go off to automatic pilot, but can we actually redefine their tasks in such a way that they can maintain that challenge and, feel like they're doing something that's worthwhile, not just for themselves, but in particular for other people. So you have a sense here that you're actually contributing something useful.
Fabulous.
I would say that personally, I'm really interested in these motivational issues, because if we really wanted to allow a larger portion of the population here to have access to this, I think we need to find those paths that would actually allow individuals to kind of find small steps here. And hopefully, you would find now that individuals who are frustrated could actually use their energy and impose more control over, their mental experience by now becoming masters, as opposed to, being almost victims of the environment.
Well, thank you so much for your insights and your candid conversation, and particularly giving us something to the audience of teachers and, speech and language pathologists, educators, psychologists who are dealing with children, and expertise is not probably what they are really focused on. But to me, managing self requires expertise in self. And so your research has incredible impact on our understanding of that. So I thank you for your time, and it was great fun.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed talking to you. It was great.
All right. It's all the time we have for today. On behalf of our host, Sucheta Kamath, today's guest, Professor Anders Ericsson, and all of us at Cerebral Matters, thank you for listening today, and we look forward to seeing you again right here next week on Full PreFrontal.
Thank you for listening to Full PreFrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive functions. To contact our host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive functions, visit her website at cerebralmatters.com. That's cerebralmatters.com. Tune in next week for the next informative episode of Full PreFrontal.